So we have a very special guest today. We have Adnan Husain. Adnan, welcome to the podcast. We're both big fans of guerrilla history. But before we start, we would just like you to introduce yourself and where you're calling from.
Well, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be on, and I'm a big fan of Red Nation podcast as well.
Oh, can you introduce yourself and where you're calling from?
Oh, sure. My name's Adnan Husain, and I am a professor of medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world history at Queen's University, currently director of the School of Religion there. And I'm active in a number of community and university campus based social justice struggles, anti war work, and anti Islamophobia work.
Excellent. And Jen and I have a lot of questions for you. But before we get into kind of the meat and potatoes of this conversation, we'd like to maybe establish a definition of terms. And we were wondering if you could give us a definition of the war on terror. I know that's a tall order, but then also reflect on, the sort of recent history of the so-called end of the forever wars, as Biden has withdrawn U.S. troops from Afghanistan, and really like what that means for the end of this so-called era.
Well, I mean, I think you're right that it's worth defining what was the war on terror. I'm actually sponsoring a talk by Arun Kundnani next month in January with the title, What Was the War on Terror? So I'm actually hoping to learn more about it. But provisionally, I guess I would say that it is the era of U.S. empire and domestic oppression, suppression, and surveillance of political dissent that was organized through a kind of Islamophobic discourse as a way of authorizing and justifying U.S. imperial intervention in the Middle East and globally, since it wasn't only in the Middle East, as a post-Cold War rationale for that U.S. empire, and accompanying it also a rationale for domestic suppression and targeting of immigrants, of religious others, that is a continuation of the racial security state that had developed, in U.S. history as a settler, colonial state for generations, but particularly had been expanded during the 60s and 70s to suppress domestic movements for liberation. Those had apparently ended, and there had been some gains made in the 70s and 80s that made it hard to justify that kind of suppression of rights. And the global war on terrorism was the opportunity for rolling back those and not only suspending any of the gains and protections that had been achieved before, but finding new ways and through the use of new technologies to militarize domestic surveillance, domestic policing. And so what we have basically is an era of about 20 years where there was unaccountable, possibilities, to expand and alter the way in which both U.S. empire was prosecuted abroad and, its effects and consequences in domestic political policy as well. And in terms of the so-called end of these forever wars, obviously, one has to applaud and be happy that the U.S. Active military occupation in Afghanistan has essentially come to an end. We don't know what the plans were for some kind of continuing franchise of U.S. control, but through authorizing other agents, or how that was going to be organized exactly with the withdrawal of most of U.S. troops. But the Taliban's really surge through the summer ended up making any possibility for arrangements that would allow U.S. direct control or indirect control moot. So we won't know exactly what would have been the plan, but it clearly was just such an exhausting drain on the U.S. military. These wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, interventions all across the Middle East and Libya, in the Horn of Africa, this. So I think in some ways overstretched U.S. Military resources in manpower and in money, that I think at a certain point when some of the goals had been achieved, really they moved towards containing nation states, like the sanctions regime, sort of a pullback from active military suppression of the region and control of the region to using the sanctions regime and this international sort of rules-based international order to hem in dissident nation states like Iran, so that they could free up, I think, energy and attention and resources for other theaters. And I think one has to look at it in this broad geopolitical way because, for example, I think the fact that the U.S. was so overstretched in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s and early 2010s, or through the mid 2010s, provided, for example, opportunities for resistance movements against U.S. hegemony and the inequalities of global capitalism, in Latin America, for example. So we had movements like, in Venezuela and Bolivia and, across the continent that in some ways that typically had been so suppressed, with this U.S. Monroe Doctrine, being so attentive to suppressing and undermining radical movements, movements for equality and liberation in its own hemisphere, that Iraq and Afghanistan allowed the possibilities in other theaters for resistance, and the pullout and reduction of U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade has meant greater attention on Venezuela and trying to subvert people's revolutions there. And I think we're also going to see, of course, a realignment, which was already announced under Obama, but was somewhat derailed. And it's hard to sort of suggest exactly what the outcomes of the Trump regime and administration was, but it's clear that under Biden, there is a concerted attempt to reorient focus on containing China's geopolitical influence. So I think, we may be happy on some level, those who care about what happens in the Middle East with the reduction of direct U.S. military involvement. But of course, it comes at a cost elsewhere in the world because, the ideology of U.S. supremacy, in the world has not been changed or altered. It's just that its theaters of operation have shifted or moved elsewhere.
Just to kind of like invoke Gerald Horne, he once said, that you can't just like walk into halfway through the movie and understand what the entire movie is about. And I feel through having read some of your work and listened to you speak on some of these things, you talk about this concept of the crusading society, and that to fully understand what we now know as the war on terror. You're a medievalist, Jen was like, what is a medievalist? And I was like, it's like Dungeons and Dragons, but in real life. I'm just kidding.
Right.
But, so
good.
To really, I think there's a tendency, just to kind of like weigh in on this, there's a tendency as historians to very much periodize our understanding of history. So for example, I got my training in like post-war, U.S. history, which is post-war for us is, post World War II. It's, there's like various other specializations, Indian policy, et cetera, social movements. And I think somebody like Gerald Horne in his work really challenges us to think about the long arc of history, which may not be so much palatable in the current like academic, disciplines that are very much becoming more particular and more narrow in their focus. But one thing, that after listening to Guerrilla History podcasts and your interviews with many of your guests, you're really looking at the longue durée of history. And, what I find compelling about your work is, looking at the movie from beginning to end, so to speak, and looking, specifically at what you call the Crusading Society. And you've given some lectures on this in the past, but also you're in the middle of writing a book, I understand, or a longer essay about the Crusading Society. And so maybe you can give us a little bit of background on what you mean on the Crusading Society, going back to Dungeons and Dragons. No, I'm just kidding.
Right, exactly. Yes. Well, I mean, I do think that there are different levels of analysis we can have for the situation we're in currently, the global war on terrorism. Already, it seems like it's a long history. I mean, this was a very long period of war and occupation since 2001, 2 decades. But we could also look at it as a post-World War II kind of phenomenon, continuation or reorientation of the Cold War, the era of U.S. Supremacy, as a superpower with its rivals, but attempting hegemony in the world. But I think in some ways, when we look at the reason why the global war on terrorism had such purchase, it wasn't just because America was attacked on 9/11 with the World Trade Towers, Pentagon, and so on, but because there already was a pre-existing sense of the Muslim as an enemy and the Islamic world as a historic rival to something called Christendom. And even though that term is really out of fashion, except on the far right or in certain kind of extreme Christian nationalist circles in evangelical groups and so on in the U.S., it's out of fashion. But it was just secularized in some ways as Europe and Europe's, global colonial and imperial drive in the early modern period. We think of it as the expansion of Europe, that also, of course, brought Europeans to this hemisphere in the Americas and the establishment of settler colonies. But before it was Europe, really, I think you have to understand what Christendom meant, because it equally was a very universalist imagination of transforming the whole world, that all the world should be under Christian power and authority. And the idea of Christendom territorially really is coextensive with the areas that were under that recognize the popes, that recognize the Pope as somehow the sort of titular spiritual, if not in some cases territorial leader of a group of states and societies that were bound together. And what made them that was that on some level, it wasn't just about faith and their ideas about religious practice and so on. It was also who they identified collectively as the threat or the enemy to this project of universal dominion. And I think you can't really understand Christendom without thinking about crusade. These are essentially coincidental in history, that they emerge, the emergence of the crusading movement and the idea of Christendom happen at the same time. And I guess the reason why I think it's important to go back to this is because even when you look at the Cold War politics, it's absolutely crucial to understand the way in which U.S. foreign policy and its concerns in international affairs during the Cold War and rivalry with communism were so significant to the way in which it used the threat of communism to suppress dissent and to suppress movements for egalitarianism, for reform and change of the economy, but also for racial justice and equality. And it was really because of Cold War pressures, one could argue, and I think many American historians have started to argue and recognize that the foreign policy questions were actually quite crucial to opening up, new legislation, desegregating in the 50s, and what made somebody really dangerous, to my mind, somebody like Malcolm X became extremely dangerous. Of course, he was a radical threat to the existing racial order as a black nationalist in the Nation of Islam. But when he started connecting in his analysis more overtly, embarrassing the United States or in the world opinion, and going and visiting new post-colonial nation states in Africa that had freed themselves from empire, where the U.S. was competing with the communist bloc, with the Soviet Union for influence, for commercial ties, and so on, that's when he became a really dangerous figure, because it really risked U.S. interests and hegemony abroad. So I think the same kind of thing we can see is really important, this external pressure, the sense of crisis and emergency that justifies internal regulation and rule. And that's what we find with the suppression of heresy in medieval Europe during this period, the kind of configuring of Jews as an internal enemy that is related and associated with the Muslim as the external rival and enemy. And so I began to see in my own studies that there were these patterns that even if some of the aspects change, because we're talking about secular politics, communism, and so on, versus, Christianity versus Islam or Judaism, Muslims and Jews, that nonetheless there was a kind of pattern of persecution internally that was connected and related to threats and militarism abroad. So I like to think that some of the foundations of whiteness and of really thinking of what is whiteness come from the ethnicization of Catholic Christianity during this period, and the way in which religion was the kind of dominant mode of understanding identity, so that it wasn't really race yet at this point, as much as it was suppressing heresy, which was forms of religious dissent, and persecuting an alien religious group, that is the Jews that were within the society, while having and mobilizing all of society, over the course of 200 years of wars, of continuous war, because of the threat of Islam and Muslims, and the fact that we needed, what am I saying? But I mean that the crusade, the crusading society, needed to expand and conquer, capture Jerusalem, but really as part of an expansion that basically Jerusalem was understood as the center of the world, and a kind of theological as well as geographic understanding. And so that is from where could spread, the expansion of Christendom into a global universalist form of rule. So that's just sort of the outlines of why I thought that when we looked at Islamophobia and the use of the Muslim as the enemy, as the kind of paradigmatic enemy of a geopolitical identity of Christendom, that, basically we had a similar pattern, and that this discourse and these patterns of thought were already available from such a long period of history, whether it was, during the Crusades or even in the early modern period, rivalry with the Ottoman Empire, and thinking of the Turk as this great, rival and enemy, as an alternate system that had to be overcome in order for Christendom and then later Europe to become dominant. And so, maybe the Cold War was a departure in some ways. This is something that Samuel Huntington really actually argued in his Clash of Civilizations, is that the Cold War, capitalism versus communism, was a departure from what he saw as the much longer, perduring clash of civilizations, principally that rivalry between Christendom and Islam. But, he adds a coda at the end that I think is so prescient for the politics we're talking about today, that the other emerging real rival was, Chinese civilization, as another one that really there was no possibility for rapprochement between these rival civilizations, and that with the end of the Cold War, we would see the resurgence again of cultural or civilizational kinds of conflict. So it seems like it was already ready and available. And if you look back at this older history, there has always been this kind of discourse of imagining the Muslim and the world of Islam as this great rival to crusade against.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask you to expand on your claim that says Islamophobia and anti-Semitism have a common origin. And then this is kind of a two-part question. But do you think that, so in my class, the U.S. War on Terror, which Nick also taught, we begin with the Indian Wars. And we talk about, as Indians being the first insurgents, and how, later on, different people are scapegoated by the U.S. and the label of terrorists placed on them. But after hearing from you, I'm wondering if it's fair to say that, that racialization and even the destruction of economies of indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere by the Spaniards was directly influenced by, this Islamophobia and these attitudes, because I think that's something that should definitely be talked about. We know that today in New Mexico, there's still, anti-Moorish, anti-Muslim celebrations that take place. They still burn a Moorish effigy in Santa Fe every fall. So I wanted to ask you if you could expand on that.
Oh, that's a great connection. That's so interesting. I think that story brings us not just broadly to Europe, where I do think that there is an association between Jews and Muslims, and that the discovery actually of Islam and of Muslims through the crusading society ends up changing the Christian's relationship to the Jew. That is, in the sense that, they had tolerated Jews. They were supposed to be subordinate. St. Augustine had kind of determined that you shouldn't kill Jews, but they should be allowed to exist. And in fact, they actually served a really important role of proving that the transmission of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible had been untampered with, and that anybody else could see, as a result of reading the Old Testament, the predictions and the coming of Jesus and the truth of Christianity. So it was useful to have them spread out through the world. They should be tolerated because they were proofs, in a way, of Christianity. And that was a kind of basic paradigm of toleration, if you want to think of it in those terms, of Jews in Christian society. It explained their role in it. But what happens during this Crusader period is that the confrontation with Islam and Muslims, and of course the emergence of heresies that sometimes actually were also against the Crusader indulgences. They expressed dissatisfaction with the way in which the church was engaging in kind of worldly sorts of conflicts that expanded its own territory. In the 13th century, Innocent III calls upon the Crusader indulgence to be given to enemies of the Papal States. He's trying to hang on to the Papal States and expand them. And so this led to abuses and corruption and criticisms and the rise of heresy that also had to be suppressed. And between this kind of emergence of popular heretical movements and unpopularity, or the kind of sense of emergency and threat of Islam and Muslims, it changed the relationship to Jews. And we see in the second half of the 12th century into the 13th century changes in more legislation that suppresses and marginalizes Jews, and changes the polemics that are made in arguing against Judaism, to see Judaism and Jews as actual threats to Christian life in a new way. And that's when we start having the blood libel accusations and those leading to pogroms and a really different approach, a much more violent approach. And in fact, actually, interestingly enough, many of the major efforts to organize and preach the crusade were, followed by and accompanied by massacres of Jews. That there was really a kind of association between these two enemies. It's like, well, first, if we're going to organize and go all the way over, to the Eastern Mediterranean, first let's deal with the enemies of Christ here. So there was a real association that the crusade, I would suggest, changed the relationship, and we really start to see something like a virulent form of anti-Semitism, emerging. So that's kind of the broad European association between, I would say, these two species of religious and racial bigotry, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and how they're connected. But really, I think what you pointed to is the experience of what happens in Spain. And here, I think what we have is the factor of settler colonialism really kind of emerging as structures of state, patterns of settlement, and the suppression of other communities that we see in the so-called Reconquista of Spain, where we had the forced conversion of Jews and Muslims. We had the expulsion of Jews, and ultimately ended up in 1609 to 1614, the expulsion of the forcibly converted community of people. They're no longer Muslims at this point. Some are crypto-Muslims, perhaps, but they're new Christians, but they are seen as unassimilable. An unassimilable minority that has to be ejected. So after a century or so of attempts of forcible conversions and attempts first to change their religion, then to outlaw Arabic, for example, or wearing of, the hijab, headscarves, women wearing henna on their hands, suppressing the hammam, the Turkish bath as it's known. These cultural practices are likewise outlawed and suppressed in an attempt to destroy the culture of the former Muslim community, and constantly they are seen as unassimilable. They speak a different language. They have different cultural habits. They listen to different kinds of music. They dress differently. And ultimately, that movement from religion through culture leads to racialization, that they are unassimilable. They can't be changed because there is something that is more endemic to their identity. And this is where you have these limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood legislation that reframes, the significance of dissent and of purity of your dissent as a marker of social identity in Spanish hierarchical Spanish society. And what we're essentially moving to is something like what we would recognize as racism in a more modern sense. And what I would suggest is that whole experience of ruling over large Muslim communities in places like Valencia that were majority Muslim until basically the 16th century. They'd been conquered in the middle of the 13th century. You have a couple of centuries where there is a majority Muslim agricultural, agrarian, peasant society being ruled over by a Christian elite coming from Aragon, moving in, bringing in settlers. They dominate the cities and control. In fact, they actually make the cities completely Christian in the sense that you couldn't live in the city if you were a Jew or a Muslim, and they, controlled this countryside, and over time they expropriated the land, but they couldn't actually take it over immediately. They didn't have the labor, the manpower, and in fact, actually, there was such a complicated system of irrigation and water resources and water sharing patterns that it would be impossible for them to displace that peasantry and maintain the agricultural productivity of the area. So it took a couple of centuries to, basically expropriate the land and eject the Muslims in processes that are very similar I would say, to what they end up doing on some level in the New World in the Atlantic. So this experience of Mediterranean encounter with Muslims ends up developing some of the techniques. Obviously, these expand and change, but some of the techniques and expectations for how you manage these suppressed, subordinate, subaltern populations. And whether you try and assimilate them or not, these are basically, they decide in the end, these are unassimilable, and they just, eject them. So when it comes to the New World, I think there are some analogies. I mean, one thing I do want to point out and mention is that, and I think these are remembered in Spanish settler colonialism in the Americas, with the dramas that you mentioned of these sort of festivals or reenactments and so on. But one thing that I think is valuable to recognize, something that's very much in the news here in Canada because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's investigation into the residential school system. These were principally religious schools, let's recall and let's remember. And their goal and target was the Christianization as well as, the suppression of indigenous languages and culture, but also Christianization. That's the culture that is to replace the religion, and the culture that is to replace, indigenous forms of belief and practice and ways of being. These kinds of things were very important also to the, archbishops and bishops who guided policy for the Spanish kingdoms. So they thought that children, Muslim children, the Morisco children, were much more assimilable. So they established in places like Granada and Valencia for schools that would Christianize, to remove these children from their parents, subject them to, a strict environment under Christianity where they could be assimilated, essentially. But in reality, of course, they were never going to be equals, fully assimilated, in a real sense. What they were doing was preparing a kind of servant class that would be good Christians that you could have in a domestic environment. So when they had these uprisings in southern Spain, in like the rising of the Alpujarras in the 1570s, when they crushed it, they captured a lot of people, including children, and they enslaved them. But they decided to liberate the children and distribute them into households, Christian households, where they could be fostered, Christianized, and in some cases they would take groups of them and educate them in these schools under the church's authority. And of course, this is a kind of story that we see that is played out
That's such a fascinating history, well. And I just have like a million questions just based on what you said, because it's parallel to Indian policy, Indian child removal policy, and I really like what Jen had brought up too, because I was thinking something along the similar lines in terms of how in indigenous studies we're taught that looking at the U.S. War on Terror and its origins within the Indian Wars. But you're really challenging us to think further back. And, one thing that I couldn't help but think about as you were talking is the doctrine of discovery, and thinking about the year 1492, not just because it's the year that, Columbus, crossed the Atlantic Ocean, but it's really the year that the Spanish crown consolidated its power. And, Mahmoud Mamdani in his book, Neither Settler Nor Native, argues that's also the year of the founding of the modern state for exactly the same reasons that you're pointing out, meaning that it was an attempt by the Spanish crown to not only create a policy of tolerance, big scare quotes right there, to how it's going to manage its internal minorities, or to make what were once majority populations into minority populations that could be then ruled by through Christian authority and domination. But thinking about how this also spurred, a kind of an era of quote unquote exploration and discovery, and how it as you pointed out, it became externalized to other parts of the globe and was codified within legal doctrine, with the Pope asserting in 1493 that explorers could essentially claim foreign territory in the name of Christendom, and that such claims were legitimate because the inhabitants or the nations were discovered, and the lands lacked European civilization, principally Christianity. And so in this way, like, Indians in the Americas became Moors and Jews on the other side of the ocean, so to speak. So I was wondering if you could maybe, like, I don't know if that's something that you've explored in your own research, but how because it goes back to one of the points that you brought up at the beginning of this discussion, and how there's this kind of critical dialectic between what we know as foreign policy and domestic policy. And we're seeing the rise of a modern state, both principally constructed by kind of this external, colonization process that's happening in the Americas, while also kind of managing its internal minorities through tolerance and indirect rule, i.e. assimilating them into Christendom itself.
Yeah, well, that's a really big topic. I mean, I'm not really an expert in the Atlantic world component of it. I just see some continuities, and I don't want to say that it's the same thing, or that the encounter with indigenous peoples immediately meant that they just categorized them in the same way or treated them the same way as the Moors or the Jews, because they also were capable of making new distinctions. And there was an important factor. There were ideas of like civilization and societies. And if you had this was the problem for them with Judaism and Islam, is that they could recognize that it had components of, structured religion. It had scriptures, it had theology, there were cities, so there were enough in the world of the Mediterranean. There were enough similarities that made the differences, in that kind of narcissism of smaller differences, very, very meaningful for patterning their relations, and how they saw the threat. But when it came to, and when they encountered sophisticated societies and cultures like the Aztecs that, had a lot of these, features, or, great monuments and all of that, they had to figure out, then do we sort of treat them as Moors and as Jews, essentially, just as non-Christians, or, are they pagans, i.e. people without an organized confessional form of religion? And, in many ways, that opened up more possibilities for enslavement, for, different kinds of policies, and also opportunities for missionizing that had been stymied in the Mediterranean. Because let's, be real. I mean, I just did a podcast recently talking about Francis of Assisi, who, I think is a very interesting saint and a fascinating figure. He was very significant in this missionizing sort of effort, however. But the problem during the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries was that it didn't work. It was impossible, it seemed, to expand Christendom through missionizing in the Mediterranean world. And so what they started to develop was a justification of conquest for the sake of missionizing, that they recognized and realized that without controlling and dominating the society militarily, it was difficult to create the right conditions in which to convert, these populations. So they justified conquest as a way to advance Christianization. And I think one thing that they found and discovered in the Americas was a greater ability to use violence successfully to control these societies and advance missionizing, through suppressing indigenous religions, or sometimes, of course, also finding ways to, as had been the case even on the continent of Europe, its Christianization took a while, partly because They needed to create forms of Christianity that could appropriate and assimilate and incorporate, pagan holy sites and holy places, but repattern them and give them a new narrative. And so this kind of syncretic process of religious interaction was something that took place in Europe, and it also, of course, ends up taking place in the Americas. So I think I've gone off in a different direction, because religious history is always so interesting to me as a scholar of these different religions. But I think the main point that you were getting at is that there are these continuities, or at least the value of a longue durée perspective is not to say, oh, it's all the same and it's always been happening in exactly the same way, but to recognize that despite the various complexities, subtleties, and nuances of each contextual moment and each different period, that nonetheless, certain things are accomplished and certain things can be built upon from the legacies of these patterns before. It's not that they just adopt exactly what went before, but it's clear that there are, there is a kind of knowledge that is built up about, how do we deal with these kinds of conditions of conquest and of subjected populations, of religious difference, of ethnic and racial and cultural difference, that there's a long period of training in certain ways under the conditions of a very diverse and contested Mediterranean that informs, it's no accident that, Christopher Columbus, was a Genoese, merchant. I mean, the Genoese were the biggest slavers of the Mediterranean. They had a global network for, getting slaves from the Black Sea and bringing them into the Mediterranean. And they believed that at a certain point, 30 or 40% of the actual population of the Republic of Genoa were enslaved people. Now, of course, they had no rights, they had no political, outlet, and it was a republic, but it's just these were not enfranchised peoples. And so it's no wonder that people like him from that sort of milieu had developed the, sailing and navigational ability, that technical element, but other forms of knowledge as well. How do you classify and deal with people who are different? If you look at Genoese records, they have an incredibly rich, if you want to put it that way, vocabulary for describing ethnic and racial and religious difference, because they had to classify all of these peoples that they had enslaved and purchased and how to sell them. And so this kind of knowledge of colonialism, of enslavement in commercial terms, these kinds of knowledges were valuable when they come into the Atlantic world. Now it gets transformed. You have the plantation complex. You have, circuits of capital that expand this dramatically in different ways. But they are starting from a position of having been informed by conflicts and the experience of managing and dealing with diversity, in the Mediterranean world when they come into the Atlantic.
Thank you again. I'm just, yeah, my mind's filling up with questions as you speak. But something that I really wanted to hone in on was, I wanted to ask, do you think that religion then becomes a vehicle for racial formation? And what made me start thinking about this was I was talking to a Jewish friend of mine, and they theorized that Hitler looked directly at blood quantum to place it upon Jewish people, and still used in Israel today, right? People are, I believe it's the matrilineal side, which, carries the authentic identity, right? And so I was thinking about, I'm always interested in looking at how Spanish policy and racial formation, kind of very smoothly transitioned, and carried over to US policy and assimilation of Pueblo people here. And so I was, interested in asking you if you think that, the way that race was informed by religion is something that the US took up from the Spanish in a sense. And we, of course, we know about the doctrine of discovery, and we know how papal bulls informed Indian policy here. But I guess I'm interested in looking at blood quantum and how that goes back to the idea of pure blood and the caste system, and if you think that perhaps that has more influence, not just for Native people here, but if how the idea of blood quantum or the caste system continues to operate, elsewhere, other places that imperialism has touched.
Yeah, wow, that's a really important and big question. I'm not sure if I'm the one to answer about all the elements of that. But what I would say is that I don't think these things just happen in a linear fashion. I think there can be, things can change. It doesn't mean that just because one thing happened at one time that it's progressively in that direction at every moment. But I think when you look, on the balance over the long period of time, that the religious difference was absolutely crucial in this era of Christendom and crusade, and that some kind of a transition was made into modernity that reshaped where the important lines of differences would be around race and the construction of race. But all along that period, there were ways in which there were overlaps and there were slippages between the two. Because, for example, in a really interesting piece, Racing Religion, Mustafa Bayoumi studies some immigration cases where, they had to classify people. And the baseline was, if you were coming from a Christian society, and of course they're thinking here at this time of Europe, since there wasn't a whole lot of immigration from other parts of the world where there was ancient, long-standing Christianity, like in Ethiopia, in the Horn of Africa and places like this, most of them are coming. So, but you had questions about like Armenians and Eastern Christians. Are they, white or not? This was something of a question. If they're speaking these other languages, they're, generally seem to be darker. How do we classify them? And likewise, there were attempts by some, Arabs, to essentially assimilate into a legal form of whiteness, right? Trying to sue essentially to be considered white. But when it came to Muslims, there was a big question mark about whether you could be white and Muslim, that it was a real problem that had to be resolved. And so there were ambiguities all the time in this overlap between religious identity and racial identity. I think that, ultimately in the later 19th and 20th century, this gets kind of worked out into, much more of an emphasis on race, because at that point also Christianity, all that missionizing, has changed the religious complexion of not only, the African diasporic enslaved peoples, but also, of course, there are Christians, around the world, in Africa, and of course all of Latin America, is Catholic Christian. So I think religion becomes much less capable of describing the forms of exclusion that are required to maintain, this elite settler colonial state, the elite of the settler colonial state. And so it moves much more to a kind of racial paradigm. But I wonder very much how it looks like from the perspective of indigenous identities. There's a long period of Christianization that happens in certain communities, but nonetheless, they're still classified, right, as Native Americans, and thus not white. But there's also a will to kind of erase that difference through assimilation. I wonder how it looks from the perspective of indigenous
it's a good question,
struggles.
and I think Christianity as like a state policy really took effect and took hold during the reservation period, because you had the transition from just like outright warfare into one of pacification or assimilation, to basically move from external kind of like rule to indirect rule. And I think those those are the policies that somebody like John Collier, who was kind of the architect of modern Indian policy as we know it today in the 20th and 21st centuries, really looked towards the English model and trying to understand the differences between, what was an overseas colony and what was an internal colony. And that, of course, has, a variety of different tactics of rule. And I think that's also important. It's that, like, what we now know as quote unquote the Middle East is a region that isn't necessarily under direct, colonization by the European or Western or NATO powers today, but nonetheless it's being controlled through like spheres of influence. Whereas, the territorial, I would think of like westward expansion, as a form of imperialism, because it's territorial annexation fundamentally, but it never entirely incorporates fully indigenous people into kind of the settler nation itself. And so it's kind of presented with this challenge at the end of the 19th century and what to do with indigenous people, and it begins that same process as you were pointing out, not the same, but a similar parallel process as you were pointing out, and sort of the de-Islamization of these quote unquote savages, these internal, minorities. It's also worth pointing out that there are three groups in the United States, three nationalities that became citizens as groups and not as individuals. There are only three groups, and that is the, Mexican Americans, which was imposed on them through the annexation after the U.S.-Mexico War, the U.S. invasion of northern Mexico. And then it became, of course, African people who were descendant of slaves or formerly enslaved. They became, citizens by a constitutional amendment, and then the indigenous people, American Indians, became citizens in 1924. And in each of these processes, I mean, they're not the same, right? But there becomes this way to sort of deracinate them, and to try to remove any kind of, in places like New Mexico or Arizona, for example, you have after the annexation of both of those territories, you have this term Spanish American that arises, right? Because it's more aligned towards European kind of identity and therefore whiteness, and less aligned towards kind of this mestizo or Mexican identity. And whereas indigenous people are just like completely out of the picture, they just want to eliminate them 100%. And then you have kind of a refashioning of U.S. citizenship with African Americans as being like, this is something that has been aspired for, and arguably it was in many ways, but it was also being actively fought over during Reconstruction, right? And you had kind of various visions of I wouldn't even call it nationalism, but identities of citizenship and what it meant to belong to this slaveholding nation, right? And so you have the active attempt to recreate society in the image of what African people see as justice, and then of course indigenous people in this time period, where there was once just kind of intense military warfare, especially during the Civil War and afterwards. This is when you see kind of the most intense conflict, and I think that's something that most people don't really talk about. But the policy shifts under Grant towards one of peace, right? He has this peace policy, and you have these major peace treaties that are signed. But with those peace treaties comes the implementation of large kind of territorial reservations that kind of have all the accoutrements of civilization, right? Education, healthcare, employment, as well as churches. And so churches become, part of this kind of civilizing mission. They have a mandate that goes back to the early 1800s, and we're receiving not to the same extent as the churches in Canada, but similar state funding and state backing to go into these communities. And it was actually many of the Indian agents and the church and the leaders of the church kind of went hand in hand, or they would switch roles. So there was this kind of back and forth. but also you had the implementation of the civilization regulations that banned, we wouldn't even call it a religion, but it turned what we were into a religion, and kind of created this sectarian divide within communities between Christians and non-Christians. And so anything that was seen as non-Christian was punishable by law. They actually created the courts of Indian offenses that were overseen not just by the Indian agents themselves, but the churches. And guess who were the people who were bringing these people in? Indian police. And so it does have that kind of parallel to what you're talking about. And each, like my community, for example, there's the Crow Creek Indian Reservation, and then there's the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. And they were basically split by, Crow Creek was more Catholic, the Lower Brule Sioux tribe was more Episcopalian. And it was just literally people would get off the boat from the war, the refugees from this war in Minnesota, and they would just sit and say, okay, you're Catholic today, you're Episcopalian. And then it was kind of like they were designated to kind of different reservations based on denomination and control. So that's really where, and of course it gets more secularized under like John Collier, but nonetheless has that kind of civilizational impulse to it. I don't know, Jen, if the situation in the Southwest is a bit different than up north, but if you want to add to that conversation.
Yeah, it's drastically different. And a big part being that our policy, or I guess Indian policy, had been being shaped by the Spanish crown for at least 2 centuries prior to, what Nick's community was going through. And so, for example, we don't have any treaties that are really applicable to us except for the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And so, we were all considered Mexican citizens at the time of the annexation. And so the U.S. actually found itself in this conundrum in whether or not to even classify Pueblo people as Indians or not, because we were thought to be pre-Christianized and pre-conquered, civilized. We were agriculturalists and, not nomadic, not savage or whatever. And then it was in the early 20th century when Indian agents started coming in, and they saw that we were still doing our ceremonies, and they were like, oh no, they're still Indians. And so that's when our citizenship, it was determined that we were not citizens, even though we were Mexican citizens prior. And, along with every other Native person, we didn't get citizenship till the 20s. And there was... and that's why I think that's a big part of why I was asking you that question initially, because the way we've been racialized, even just within the past 200 years, has been all over the place. We've occupied so many different, racial identities. And now the way blood quantum impacts us, it almost correlates authentic indigeneity with being Catholic. And so it's really interesting the way Spanish policy, Mexican policy, and US policy have collectively created our political position as it is presently. But yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, a couple of things that occurred to me when you were both talking is how significant or important non-Christian practices were in undermining status, citizenship, and so on. So clearly Christian identity was tied to citizenship in important ways. And that reminds me very much of the way in which the Inquisition worked. I mean, because you forcibly converted a large population of Jews and Muslims, they're now called New Christians. And of course, there's a distinguishing, social status that comes with being an old Christian versus a new Christian, the migrating essentially to lineage away from religion. Since now we're all part of the same religion, supposedly we have to draw social distinctions on a different basis, and that's that move that goes towards racializing. But nonetheless, the obvious problem that the assimilation doesn't work well. So you have the survival of, Muslim practices. People are still speaking Arabic. They're still refusing to eat pork. This becomes then a big marker of actually publicly forcing people to, show that they have assimilated by eating pork and stopping, refraining from going to the public baths that had been on a Thursday night or on a Friday morning ahead of Muslim religious services and so on. And so the office of the Inquisition kind of pulls in a surveillance network from within the community as well as people from without to monitor people's practices. And of course, people, prosecute their own social conflicts and, contestations over resources and power by accusing one another before this, in order to advance themselves, to become informants, to deal with rivals, and to grab inheritance, and so all kinds of social competition can be mediated through this colonial institution that is imposed that creates this surveillance kind of network. And so when we look to what happened under the war on terror, for example, the recruiting of all of these Muslim informants, either they're recruited, for material and financial gain, or, the legal conditions of their own immigration and citizenship status and the vulnerabilities that they have are being often very, exploited. If you want to stay in the country, you better, inform on this community for us. That we find that very similar kinds of networks of surveillance, emerge to say, well, who's going to the mosque a lot? Let's find out, who, and at the same time, those figures are often, provocative agents, as we know from, COINTELPRO in the 60s and 70s, is that very often the people who are recruited to be the arm of the surveillance and security state are the ones who are pushing the most kind of obvious radical agenda to manufacture and fabricate, plots, terrorism in this kind of paranoid, political reality in the post 9/11 context. This was kind of just the standard operating procedure for the expanded Homeland Security, FBI, and all kinds of other programs like Countering Violent Extremism, which was an attempt, to have community interface in Muslim communities, but really in some sense was how to try and identify people who should be monitored more intensively. So there's like a first level surveillance of having these programs sponsored in mosques and visits with the FBI, and to promote kind of cooperation and to play upon the assimilationist model minority paradigms that many of these, immigrants are very susceptible to. They just want to be part of the American dream, and this gets exploited by whole communities collaborating and cooperating, sometimes almost unwittingly, but, they should be more witting in their own kind of marginalization. And that's really how it worked. And that's something that happened, with the Moriscos and Jews subject to the Inquisition. And I imagine, it's also a story that is pretty familiar in indigenous communities.
Like we're recording in December
as well.
So I don't know when this is going to publish, but 4 days ago was the anniversary of the assassination of Sitting Bull. And he, a lot of people point out that he was assassinated by the Indian police force, who came to monitor and crush the ghost dance because it was seen as kind of this religious fueled kind of uprising, even though Sitting Bull himself wasn't really quite a practitioner, even though he respected it, in terms of that it gave hope to the people. But one of the ways that they tracked his movements is that they actually conscripted an informant that was a relative of his named One Bull. And it's not really well published in a lot of the popular literature, but the Indian agent McLaughlin was the guy, he was getting direct reports from this guy One Bull on where, what Sitting Bull was talking about, how he was thinking. It wasn't just about, bringing back the old ways. He was actually organizing against the General Allotment Act. He was like, we can, and he was going to the Crows, who are often characterized as our kind of traditional enemy. And he was speaking to them and saying, we need a united front on allotment to oppose this policy. But it was being framed as this kind of like fanatic religious cult that he was participating in, and he was going to lead this uprising, even though most of the practice of the ghost dance didn't involve weapons, didn't involve anything like of that nature. But it gets to this another question. You spoke about it a little bit, but this idea of like informants is being used to infiltrate these organizations. And one of the things I've read a lot of the FBI files, and so this piece called "Enemies," Muslims, Enemies of the State, by Hatem Bazian. I don't know if I said his name correctly. Hatem Bazian. He talks about the kind of the legacies of COINTELPRO, and one thing he doesn't really get into in this piece, but one thing that I found was really interesting is that these informants were instructed specifically to identify any relations, foreign relations, that the Black Panthers, that Nation of Islam, would have with foreign governments, or foreign movements. And that's what they were primarily interested in. I don't want to like split hairs here, but I would say that the COINTEL program ended in 1971. Maybe that's a controversial take, but me as a historian, I would say it ended. But the institutional knowledge, and he correctly points out, this was not a program, but programs, that they were kind of like surveilling all of these different groups. But it continued, like for the American Indian movement, which I've studied quite a bit and quite extensively. They were, there's this really interesting report that came out in after they outed one of the informants. His name was Douglas Durham. He was a fake Indian. That's a whole nother story. But when he was testifying in this like really kind of like mock congressional hearing that was totally fake and fabricated, he made explicit to connect not only the American Indian movement's alleged connections to like the Communist Party, Trotskyist organizations, Cuba, but also he was explicit in connecting them to the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. So you kind of see this the early, or like the more early kind of forms of the FBI's interest in domestic organizations, connections with foreign elements or whatever. But it's also fascinating because that's beyond the purview of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But they were also working with like the CIA through Operation Chaos at the time that was doing domestic surveillance. And so they don't even have a clear boundary between like what is external and what is foreign. But I wanted to maybe ask you a little bit, because you touched on it a little bit, because when I was politicized by the invasion of Iraq, the second invasion of Iraq, and it never really occurred to me, at the time I hadn't really developed politically, and I knew that there was repression against the Muslim community, but to me it didn't seem like it was like the same. I couldn't make the connection back to COINTELPRO because COINTELPRO really developed around the anti-war movement in Vietnam, the U.S. invasion of Vietnam. And also, there was state surveillance with the invasion of Iraq. It really kind of intensified. But to me, it didn't connect because until after reading this piece, it really solidified. But can you kind of like draw out why they would target, what? It wasn't just because they spoke a different language. It wasn't just because, they didn't eat pork. But there were like real like geopolitical interests involved in suppressing, a kind of anti-war movement by targeting the Muslim community, expressly for, as he points out in this piece, for its kind of alliance or perceived alliance with Palestinians.
Well, that is a very kind of significant issue, and one, of course, that connects settler colonialism in both contexts. Before getting exactly to that point, I did want to mention that one interesting difference between the COINTELPRO probing for connections with the international communist, order or with foreign governments, there was no way to characterize indigenous resistance, AIM, as not genuinely rooted and situated in this country and this land. And likewise, there was no way you could call into question the indigeneity in some sense, the belongingness of African Americans struggling for their freedom. So what was dangerous, however, was whether this, America's racial apartheid and racial order and settler colonial genocide could be connected to weakening the U.S. claims in the Cold War propaganda to freedom, democracy, to being a better system that guaranteed people's rights and dignities, during the Cold War. That was the problem. That created, so the foreign and the domestic were linked, but the link had to be made. I think one of the unique dimensions for expanding this nexus of the relationship between domestic suppression of dissent and foreign imperial militarism, what was so useful in the global war on terrorism is that Islamophobia, this historic kind of sense that Muslims were an alien enemy. They were other to Christian society, to whiteness. It allowed that connection to be, it didn't have to be really established. It was assumed. It was assumed that any Muslim was potentially a fifth columnist, a sleeper agent for the global jihadist network, simply because they could not be understood, as anything other than recently arrived immigrants with an alien culture and religion, and likely, as a consequence, political affiliations and to other ideologies. So that, I think, was very important in how it linked these things together very, very easily. That's what it was useful for, is that you could then expand the suppression of dissent. You could round up, thousands of people, as they did right after 9/11 in the first couple of months, and hold them indefinitely in detention facilities with no charge, simply because they were assumed that they could be guilty of some kind of foreign affiliation and alliance, and so they could be subject to detention, they could be subject to torture, because they weren't politically recognizable within American law. Essentially, they could be cast out from American law, and so that's why so many immigrants, in particular, were rounded up. But then domestic Muslim communities were under another round of surveillance, because even if they held political citizenship, they were culturally or religiously alien in some profoundly important way. But in terms of the Palestine, I mean, I remember during the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, well, even in the first Iraq War and in the second Iraq War, I remember Saddam Hussein raising the problem of Palestine, and this was just dismissed as, oh, this is a red herring that he is using to distract from, his own crimes and this sort of thing. But in fact, actually, there was something kind of, I think, profound and important about the fact that, globally, the U.S. just never has had a good sense of how it's viewed abroad in the rest of the world. It just doesn't understand that it's obvious to people, to billions of people around the world, that the U.S. is involved in suppressing freedom and rights, and in particular that its allies are allowed to abuse, commit, ethnic cleansing, and to occupy, and to round up political prisoners, to engage in collective punishment, which again is another important, kind of structure that I think needs to be related here to this longue durée history, as well as the tactics and techniques of the global war on terrorism, and also, I would imagine, also to indigenous resistance, is that, punishment was collectivized. It was sort of assumed that you have this identity and that the entire community, should be subject to the kinds of forms of surveillance and suppression. So it's so evident to the rest of the world, the injustice that's taking place. And, it's a failure of the U.S. It's not even, not that I would wish the U.S. empire to be more capable and more, intelligent in its operation, but the fact that it doesn't understand how it's seen as hypocritical in this way, is a real weakness of its more propagandistic side. I mean, you have right now, for example, this new conference, the Biden administration was busy kind of lecturing the world on, the rapid demise globally of liberal democracy, and how human rights are threatened everywhere, and press freedom. Meanwhile, Julian Assange is being, kept under such an incredible regime, of imprisonment, simply for publishing the truth about U.S. crimes. I just think that that the Palestine question has become such an incredible third rail, of U.S. politics. Like, you can really tell where people stand on the questions of U.S. empire fundamentally by where they stand on the Palestine question. And, I think probably it also is extremely revealing about, the nature of the U.S. as a settler colonial state, that it is so incapable of recognizing its own history and how it appears to the rest of the world, where that critique is very obvious and possible to make. But it's because it is a settler colonial state that it cannot really envision or see and understand how settler colonialism is operating in Palestine.
So in the slides you sent us titled Good Muslims, Bad Muslims, well, first of all, that phrase rings familiar, right? Good Indians, bad Indians, good Jews, bad Jews. And what's something really interesting is you start by talking about how that, binary was kind of based on the idea of, some being relegated to primitivity or medieval times, and versus those who come into modernity, which is also a big part of how indigenous, racial construction happens. And you go on to talk about the stakes for the Cold War and how at that time, the Mujahideen were being seen as heroes, celebrated because they were anti-Soviet, and how quickly the script was flipped. And so I was just wondering if you could go into detail about that, this good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy, and how it's playing out today.
Well, this is, I think, clearly the division, the dichotomy is, in some senses, it's a false, distinction, and it's a false dichotomy. In a lot of discourse and in practicality, you could say that the U.S. Global war on terrorism policy really refuses to distinguish between good Muslims or bad Muslims. I mean, there's a fiction that there are good Muslims, i.e. those who support U.S. foreign policy, either abroad, Muslims abroad, or domestically Muslims who support U.S. Foreign policy, who are willing to assimilate politically, you might say, to the norms of American society, who want to be a model minority rather than act in solidarity with other, racial and religious communities that are suffering oppression in the U.S. But so as long as they don't identify in those terms, then they could technically be, good Muslims. And in fact, sometimes they actually need good Muslims in order to legitimize, their policies and their programs, to immunize, from it being a racial or religious form of prejudice. And also sometimes they need these so-called good Muslims because they also seem not to be able to understand, what's happening, in Muslim communities, either domestically or abroad. And so they need collaborators and cooperators in order to, despite the fact that this leads to all kinds of, insane results, that we've seen, in Hatem Bazian's article, how many fabrications, end up, these informants don't bring back, quality intelligence. What they do is they fabricate conditions and situations because that's, their role and their job is to provide so-called knowledge. But fundamentally, I would say, is that if you look at the global war on terrorism, and increasingly in far-right discourses as well, is that it's a distinction without a difference, in terms of how the policy actually works. So, it's useful discursively, but in practicality, it's not a meaningful difference, I think, in terms of the targeting and racializing of the security state. It's useful in order to legitimize it, but in practical terms, Muslims are cast out, from legitimate citizenship, from political rights, and are rendered, the kind of medieval, or savage, unassimilable threat to modernity and liberal democracy if they adhere to their religion. So the only way to be a good Muslim, fundamentally, it seems by the logic of this, is not to be a Muslim, any longer. And of course, there's still the racial residue that may, bind people into this category, but fundamentally speaking, it is characterized as a threat to the norms of political order, of democracy, and of cultural advancement, and is sort of regarded or frozen through all of these stereotypes, these Islamophobic stereotypes that have such a long history and are incubated even, since the medieval period as part of crusade war propaganda, that the Muslim is essentially frozen in that history.
To kind of pivot on that, I guess, just kind of an aside, it's also like good Muslim, bad Muslim. It's like whether or not you're pro-Saudi or not also kind of factors into that, because the U.S. can never break its alliance with Saudi Arabia, no matter what it says about any Muslim country. The human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia never get covered. There was an excellent piece actually by Adam Johnson from Citations Needed. He wrote a little bit about that, talking about how Vice News is basically like a pro-Saudi, pro-Saudi outlet now because of its cover. I mean, how it covers countries like Cuba as, this dictatorial regime where there's shadow police. There's always this kind of double standard. And I kind of want to think a little bit about, this present moment and going back to how we began this conversation. And Jen and I each have, one final question that we want to ask you. My question is looking at how the withdrawal from Afghanistan, is really kind of a strategic move on behalf of Biden, because he even said this in his speech. He's like, we need to refocus our energy towards China, because China is now the number one threat. And there's a lot to this. It might need its own episode at some point. And we've talked a lot about it here and, internally with the Red Nation, but also, looking at the new Cold War and what it's really kind of entailing and drawing the United States into. China has surpassed the United States in terms of GDP and wealth. That was a recent kind of news story that didn't really make much headlines. And so in many ways, we're seeing the end of the so-called American century. The the United States is a declining superpower, but nonetheless remains equally dangerous, if not more dangerous today than it was the day that Biden withdrew troops from Afghanistan. Because much like during Reconstruction, when Grant withdrew troops, or not Grant, but when they withdrew troops from the South that were overseeing the Reconstruction era, they didn't just disappear, right? They moved westward to begin a campaign of extermination and westward expansion into the western part of what is now the United States. The same could be said about Afghanistan. Those troops didn't just disappear in this failed nation building project in Afghanistan. They were redeployed. Many of them were redeployed into the Pacific, but they're fighting an enemy that is a state actor, right? And that we don't really have an officially declared war on yet. It's like it's a Cold War in that sense. And so there are a lot of different factors. And so it's been more exploding into the realm of what we call, or what we understand as hybrid warfare, because the strategic interest cannot be solved within, the battlefield. It'd be devastating for the entire planet if China and the United States went to war. But nonetheless, it means that the United States is still, going after implementing sanctions against its perceived or China's perceived allies in Latin America, or across the globe. The United States is implementing sanctions against about 1/3 of the population of the planet. And the United States used to be kind of one of the main hegemons in terms of pushing these IMF loans onto countries, and now China is becoming the preferred lender because of its less punitive kind of loan agreements and debt repayment. And so you have all of this restructuring, and so the United States is kind of grasping at straws in the sense that it's saying that China is the new barbarians and the new anti-Muslim barbarians for what they're allegedly doing to the Uyghur minority population in Xinjiang. And the rest of the country is like, so when did the United States actually care about Muslims? Do you not remember the last, the war on terror? This is a big question, but you said earlier that we may be seeing the kind of end of the U.S. war on terror era, and we may be transitioning into another one. And I just want to hear your thoughts on like what this new kind of pivot towards Asia and the kind of marshaling of resources and the institutions that were created and built up during the war on terror, and how it's kind of like where do you see this going? I mean, what's happening and what should we be paying attention to?
Well, this is I think, a vital and important question. I mean, I'm not an East Asia specialist to know exactly, how U.S.-China policy is working on the ground. But I think you're right that it is important to see this as another chapter, or as having some continuities with the global war on terrorism. But, it's in a different frame, as you point out, against a state actor. So it is a little bit like the Cold War in that there is a super state, a superpower with its affiliates and allies that have been created through commercial and other geopolitical relationships. China's Belt and Road Initiative, has forged connections and interdependencies with a wide range of, states, former communist bloc states, as well as third world states, the global south. And in fact, I think you're absolutely right that China has become an alternative, is providing an alternative system to that so-called rules-based order. In fact, all that the U.S. is and Europe and the U.S. are, trying to promote as the only basis for a peaceful global world, that you have to be part of this so-called rules-based order. But in fact, actually, all of these countries that are under sanctions, and you point out so rightly that there are hundreds of millions of people, billions of people who are suffering under essentially what the global war on terror did to enemy combatants in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, say that you are out of the conventions, the international protections, that rules-based order of Geneva Conventions. So none of those protections apply to you. We can detain you without charge. We can torture you. You are outside of the law, right? And so the rogue states, it starts with that axis of evil, a speech in some ways from the global war on terrorism, where George Bush kind of announced the global war on terrorism as targeting these rogue states, an axis of evil. So all of these countries, Venezuela, Iran, Syria, they are subject then to this punitive regime where they are evicted from this kind of rules-based order. They cannot, finance anything. They cannot participate and pursue their interests, and instead they are under blockade, under sanction, under various kinds of controls and isolation. And really, the only alternative they have is to join with the other rogue states, as friends of the charter, of the UN Charter. This is a very interesting development. I heard Vijay Prashad talking about it very eloquently, about this new movement, which is a recognition of reality that there are a number of countries that have to band together and are making an appeal for following the UN Charter, because the US is the one that's acting, and its allies are acting as the rogue states that aren't recognizing nation-state sovereignty. They're trying to create an entirely different international system that doesn't abide by the UN Charter. So we see that also with the only advantage that the United States seems to have during this kind of period of decline that I think you rightly point out, is the fact that it is so invested in its military infrastructure and technology that is almost the only industrial part of the U.S. economy in which it has a competitive advantage. China's economy and technology are developing rapidly. They have their own kind of social media. They have their own, Amazon, Alibaba is massive as a, internet, commercial space. So they are presenting an alternative that is truly a rival to U.S. hegemony. And that, I think, is what's really fueling it. So we see this AUKUS pact, which is a resurrection of these Cold War pacts that the U.S. sponsored, these regional defense agreements and treaties, like SEATO. I mean, this is basically like SEATO. And, of course, there was NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but then they sponsored the Baghdad Pact. They, sponsored the Manila Pact that created SEATO, which was a way of not only creating a military alliance, but I think really fundamentally providing a market, a closed market for U.S. military technology, because this is the only, area. So they're trying to enforce a kind of monopoly in almost the only area of technology and industry that they have a competitive advantage. So they're trying to protect it by creating a military pact that makes, Australia, have to purchase U.S. nuclear submarines and U.S. military technology, and not just the technology, but also the servicing, kinds of agreements. The, you have to have command structures that work across different nations if you're part of a military pact like this. So what we see is that this is a geopolitical, military, and commercial alliance in response to the growth of China and the fact that an alternate system is starting to emerge around the globe. I think it's very, interesting. It's a totally losing battle. I mean, America has been a declining empire the global war on terror, for a long time, the global war on terrorism both exposed its weaknesses and subjected it to overextension that is accelerating now its decline economically and geopolitically, but it also gave it a lease on life for a brief period by, remilitarizing, U.S. society when, after the Cold War, there were reasonable expectations of a peace dividend, of, nuclear disarmament, of many other possibilities that were derailed. And I think that's one of the huge tragedies of the global war on terrorism, is that any attempt to gain a peace dividend and to break out of the consequences of the Cold War, to have a critique of U.S. empire, to roll back military spending, to kind of have a new relationship to the world, is obviously impossible under the global war on terrorism. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the U.S. responds to this. And I see that many aspects of what was developed in the global war on terrorism, particularly in advancing U.S. security, surveillance technology, and the military-industrial complex, that these are the only advantages that the U.S. has. So it has to promote a kind of world system in which this is maintained, with, I think, terrible consequences for the world.
So, what do you make of the way the, quote, new Cold War and the ongoing war on terror is used as a cover to target BDS supporters, anyone who's pro-China, and in general, we're seeing this impact people's lives, most of the time professors, right? And intellectuals, public intellectuals, who are being red baited and deplatformed, barred from finding employment, right? Like, how long until it's illegal to be a communist again here is something that I'm really thinking about. What do you think?
Well, I think that dynamic that we've been talking about of U.S. foreign policy and the international geopolitical circumstances, do have major consequences domestically. And we saw that in the global war on terrorism. We've seen the Patriot Act. We've seen the way in which providing material aid and, for terrorism could be criminalized. And what they meant by that, it was defined in such a way that discursively, expressing dissent against U.S. empire or in favor of the international legal principle that an occupied people can resist occupation and seek liberation and defend themselves, is completely under attack and is being made criminal. So I think that principle that was developed in the global war on terrorism discourse and legislation, and of course, I think that was based on earlier red baiting and the McCarthyite era and panics, in the era of the Cold War that suppressed the left. But that had not been, I think, possible to justify. And so the global war on terrorism provided the rationale for reasserting those kinds of states of emergency and national security logic in a much broader way. And we're dealing with the consequences of those precedents being set during the global war on terrorism, because these can easily be continued now, as you just pointed out, Jen, on all of these other elements of, solidarity with China, or even if you're just anti, a Cold War, a very dangerous rivalry between two nuclear powers that could be devastating for the planet. I think, the criminalizing of dissent is one of these unfortunate, horrific legacies. The suppression of journalism. I mentioned Julian Assange suffering, and now looks like may be extradited to stand trial, for espionage in the U.S. This is absolutely outrageous, but it shows the fact that it hasn't created a upsurge of dissent on the left is an example of the narrowing possibilities for both culturally and potentially legally, but first it's happening culturally, of critique of U.S. empire and of these policies, that we're so obviously observing were ramped up during the global war on terrorism, but there's no sign of their abating, because in fact, actually, the left, it seems, has become inured to supporting the security state. This is one of the really crazy things that seems to have happened in the Trump and post-Trump era, and is being authorized by this rivalry with Russia and China in particular, is that we're falling into a completely paranoid style of American politics again. It's moved from the Muslim as the paradigmatic enemy in the global war on terrorism to yet new enemies that need to be confronted. And it's really disturbing and distressing how the real cancel culture, we hear a lot about the cancel culture, that you can't say anything and that there's just a political correctness is overwhelming public discourse and dialogue, particularly on university campuses. But it's clear that the real cancel culture comes against those who really critique U.S. empire or have a principled stand against it. And I think the canary in the coal mine for this really has been pro-Palestine solidarity that has been criminalized increasingly over the last 2 decades, to the extent that BDS, a peaceful form of protest, and an act of solidarity that is a call made by Palestinian people and civil society organizations themselves for solidarity, has become completely anathema, I think. And that's why I think Palestine is such a third rail in American politics. I mean, and actually it's become, I think, likewise, it used to be different in Europe, but we've seen the same pattern. Look what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, and so all across Europe, likewise, Palestine solidarity has increasingly become criminalized. You cannot advocate for the one-state solution in, a principle of democratic equality of citizenship, political rights and human rights for everyone in a single democratic state. This is anathema. It cannot be advocated in Germany at this point. BDS cannot be advocated in Germany. It's really very distressing, and it's going to. This is, I think, what it suggests is that all across in our movements, we have to maintain principled solidarity with one another, because the problem has been is that if we think of it only as a question of Islamophobia, and it can be rationalized as legitimate in the global war on terrorism logic, it has led to the erosion of political rights, broadly speaking. And this is exactly the same problem that existed, in the 60s and 70s, that if you cannot coordinate all of these movements together and express solidarity, it's very easy for particular movements, particular struggles to be marginalized, isolated, criminalized. And that is what's happened with Palestine solidarity. But now we're starting to see the broader consequences and effects on our whole political discourse and dialogue, and the erosion of our political rights.
So where can our listeners today keep up with all of your work, social media, publications, anywhere else we might be able to keep up with you?
Well, I think the best way is to follow me on Twitter at Adnan A. Husain, 1 S-A-I-N. And if you're interested in the approach to history that I and my co-hosts take for radical histories and the ways in which struggles from the past can inform contemporary social justice struggles, making the past a usable resource in our struggles. Check out Guerrilla History, Guerrilla, our podcast. And also I host a podcast called The Majlis, Majlis, that is about the Middle East, Islamic world, Muslim diasporic experiences and histories. And that's also available on all the platforms.
Well, thanks so much, Adnan. This was a very enlightening conversation. I think we only really scratched the surface of it, and we're going up to 2 hours right now, at least the way I feel. But I really appreciate you taking the time to join us, and hopefully we can have you back on the show.
I'd love to. I enjoyed it so much, and I learned a lot from both of you. So thanks so much for the dialogue. It was really terrific.